Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with episode 62 and the third in my mini-series on Krishnadevaraya. Before I begin though, a quick word to tell you that last week, this podcast, The History of Bangalore, was chosen by Apple Podcasts as one of the best yet of 2025. We stand honored, Apple. The year is 1512 and the map of the Deccan has never looked more fractured or more dangerous. With Bijapur in the north, the Gajapatis in the east, and on the west the new menace, the Portuguese, Vijayanagara stood, surrounded by powers with whom any truce is only ever temporary. An uneasy lay Krishnadeva's head, even though he had responded to early threats with dazzling force and speed. He had taken the throne in 1509. It seemed that so much has happened, and yet it was only 1512. That's where I left you in the last episode, and now I will get into the rhythm of his rule. But that, as soon as I take leave to first thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Krishnadevaraya's first years on the throne had been about holding the empire together. He had quelled a rebellion in Mysore and faced down a probing incursion from Bijapur. And as I've said before, these were not great set-piece battles, but they did prove his ability to move quickly, strike decisively, and importantly to keep enemies from mistaking any restraint for weakness. By 1512, the realm was stable, the borders secure, and Krishnadeva had the means to expand his empire. But 1512 was not the year for another grand war. The empire's strength needed consolidation. Those borders needed holding, and that without exhausting the treasury or bleeding the army. And again by 1512, the Bahmani Sultanate was quickly fading from memory. Between the 1400s and the present, the Bahmani state had broken up into 5 separate pieces, 5 separate sultanates: Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Berar, Bidar, and Golconda. Each was born in the turbulence of the 1490s out of a long slide from central Bahmani authority to near total autonomy. Each was ruled by a man who had once served in the Bahmani court. The first to go was Ahmednagar in the northwest, where Malik Ahmed Shah had set up a breakaway sultanate in 1490. In the same year, Yusuf Adil Shah took Bijapur, and Faithullah Himadul Mullik claimed Berar. In 1492, Qasim Barid I moved. He seized Bidar, and not to be left behind on the eastern side, Quli Qutb Shah would soon make Golconda fully independent. It was a formality that happened only in 1518, although Golconda had long acted as his own master. Each of these sultanates had a strength. Bijapur controlled the routes from the western coast into the interior. The Adil Shahis rulers were ambitious but cautious. They knew from their first skirmish with Krishnadeva that he could not be taken lightly like his predecessors. So they decided to bide their time. Towards the northeast, Golconda set their sights on that rich Telangana region, and the Gajapatis still were clinging to their coastal strongholds in Andhra. This whole thing led to a rather delicate geometry. Together, these sultanates were a patchwork of rivals, wary of each other and of Vijayanagara in the south. And as if this wasn't enough, the Portuguese, ensconced in Goa since 1510 after the naval battle of Diu, were not another sultanate to be played off one against the other. They were a singular force, soldiers, merchants, and missionaries with cannon, maps, and militant navy that had sailed from the far side of the world. So in 1512, the question for Krishnadeva was not only whom to fight, but when, and just as importantly, why. The decade to follow would not be decided only by military campaigns, but with Krishnadeva choosing his battles wisely, which enemies to contain, which to confront and conquer, and which ones with whom he would simply trade. This is the stage on which our story unfolds. The empire stood at a moment of poised strength, while Krishnadeva was about to play a game of deterrence on the one front, trade and diplomacy on the other, and conquest where it would pay him the best. It was his ability to make compromise with himself that allowed him to employ and deploy the right amount of aggression in his efforts. One doesn't earn the reputation of being one of the greatest kings of South Indian history without a lot of evidence to prove it. What earned this reputation for Krishnadeva in his relatively short reign could only have been the work of an insomniac. Why I use this word is interesting from descriptions of how the king operated with very little sleep. According to ancient sources, Krishnadeva would, every day following the night assembly, disguise himself and wander about the town incognito. He would listen at people's windows, apparently eavesdropping on conversations, and then he would sneak back into the palace only just before daybreak. After barely any sleep, he would get ready for the early morning prayers, get down his physical routine, which included riding his horse expertly over a great distance, and then return, all while it was still dawn. Later, he would take his seat in the great audience hall as his first order of business in the grand hall, still remembering what he had seen and heard while moving through the city the night before. Krishnadeva would call in Jangamaya, the Talari, or the city watchman. The Talari's job was to report every noticeable thing that had happened within the city walls. If his report matched what Krishnadeva already knew from his own inspection, he would simply listen and say nothing. But if it fell short, the king would fix him with a withering look and let loose some sarcasm. You don't know about the incident that happened in that house, in that row, on that street, in that ward? And yet, your Talari come and my kingship are both supposed to be excellent. When this happened, Jangamaya, terrified and paranoid that someone was carrying tales to the king, set up an expansive spy network to keep tabs on everyone, including this royal nocturnal prowler. Much information about Krishnadeva comes to us from the literary tome Raya Vachakamu, or Accounts of the King. From internal analysis of the text, historian Philip Wagner believes that it was likely commissioned by the Madurai Nayakas and to have been written between 1591 and 1675, which is the long time spanning sources near contemporary to generations afterwards. Like a lot of Indian historical literature, the wall between fact and fiction is rather low. Anyway, it was clear from the time it took to write Raya Vachakamu that the authors were not insomniacs like Krishnadevaraya. Over history, we hear frequently of high thinkers and high achievers who were insomniacs with terrible sleeping habits and little effective sleep. Given the number of them, we might believe that there was a connection. Charles Dickens, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Bill Clinton, George Clooney and Lady Gaga. In history, Caligula was supposed to be sleepless and he would wander the palace halls restless, loudly crying and longing, calling out for the dawn. Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, was an insomniac, but the most famous of them all, and a contemporary of Krishnadeva, was Leonardo da Vinci. The subject of insomnia has obsessed people for a long time. Aristotle wrote about it in his essay De Somno et Vigilia, meaning on sleep and sleeplessness, and he wrote that between 335 and 322 BC. Maybe he was inspired by his most famous pupil, Alexander the Great, who was also driven by restless ambition and, of course, sleep disorder. Ironically, I decided to read Aristotle's essay on sleep disorders at 4 a.m., unable to fall asleep. Turned out, it wasn't such a great idea. Tales of Krishnadeva's insomnia need not be debated for factual accuracy, but we can, from those tales, understand that Krishnadeva's 24/7 commitment was to his kingship and his ability to create a high-functioning court and country simply by setting an example and expecting everyone to follow. And while this restless king prowled the streets of his capital at night, the world outside was shifting, principally in the form of his three rivals, Bijapur, Gajapatis, and the Portuguese. And as I said at the start of this episode, this situation presents me with the opportunity to show how differently Krishnadeva had decided to deal with each of them. Deterrence for Bijapur, calculation for the Portuguese, and when it came to the Gajapatis, outright war. We will go into all that right after this commercial break. Stay right where you are. It gets exciting. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back. The political weather across the Deccan in the early 1510s could have read like a forecast of storms on all horizons. There was trouble in all cardinal directions. For Krishnadeva, the first and most pressing test after his ascendancy had come from Bijapur. They were testing him, and I mentioned this in the previous episode, but here are more details. The Bijapur frontier was never a quiet one. Soon after Krishnadeva's 1509 coronation, Yusuf Adil Shah sent a probing force to the Vijayanagara border. For context, the bone of contention between the kingdoms was always the Raichur Doab. It was a flat, fertile, contested stretch between the Krishna and the Tungabhadra rivers. And the Raichur fort itself sat guard over the area, and that was a prize that everyone wanted. Because the fort was not just a stone citadel on a hill. It was the key that unlocked both rivers, a choke point for trade, and a symbol of prestige. Now, the Adil Shahi move was cautious, almost testing to see whether this new Raya was made of softer stuff than his already soft predecessors. Krishnadeva answered that question before it was asked. Working on information from his spies about what Adil Shah was planning, and their gratuitous mention that Adil Shah had spoken dismissively about him, the new king, Krishnadeva had decided on preemptive action. He moved his forces quickly, striking into the Doab with a combination of infantry, cavalry, and siege artillery. Raichur fort was taken, and the counterattack was swift enough to rattle Bijapur's court. In the fighting that followed, Yusuf Adil Shah himself was killed. Now, whether his death was actually from this battle and battle wounds or some other disease is still debated. But for Vijayanagara, the outcome was clear. The Doab, at least for the moment, was theirs. But frontiers are fluid and fickle, and Bijapur regrouped, and with that fluidity of Deccan warfare, the Doab slipped back into their hands in the months that followed. Still, the message had been sent. Krishnadeva would not be tested lightly. He could and would respond with overwhelming force, and he would do so without hesitation. The sultanates took note. And then there was the Andhra Gajapati issue, which was both a problem and an opportunity for Krishnadeva. But before we head east with Krishnadeva into the Andhra lands, let's take a step back to the early months of 1510, and this was just before the Umattur revolt that we had discussed in the last episode. It was during this time that a Franciscan friar named Louis arrived in Goa. He came not long after the Portuguese naval commander Afonso de Albuquerque had defeated Goa in the naval battle of Diu, which happened in February 1510. Now, that one battle had changed the geometry of Western India. Until then, Goa had been a contested harbour between Vijayanagara and Bijapur, and now a third player had entered the scene and dominated both. The importance of Goa was that it was more than just a city. It was the principal maritime gateway to Vijayanagara, where caravans from the interior brought merchandise to sell. It was the funnel through which the wealth of the Deccan could pour into the hands of whoever controlled it. And the most valuable cargo of all was not spices, not silks, but horses. And Albuquerque had just turned it into a Portuguese stronghold. The Portuguese had at the same time also taken control of key Middle Eastern ports like Hormuz and Aden, giving them dominance over the entire sea route for the Arabian and Persian war horses, the most single valuable military import into South India. Now, there is a point where the imperatives of trade meet the imperatives of the military. This basically means that Krishnadeva needed those war horses. The overland horse trade to the Deccan, which came in from the north, had collapsed even a century earlier after the Bahmani revolt from Delhi rule in the mid-14th century. With no reliable route from Central Asia or North India, elite cavalry could only be supplied by importing hardy horses that traveled on ships across the Arabian Sea. In the armies of South India, cavalry was decisive. Local breeds could not carry an armored rider into battle at speed. The best war horses came from Arabia and Persia, And now with the Portuguese having taken control of everything, the only way to get the horses into land was through Goa. Afonso de Albuquerque understood the leverage that it gave him. He understood exactly what this meant for Krishnadeva. So in letters to his king, Dom Manuel, Albuquerque declared that whoever controlled the horse trade would control the balance of power in the Deccan. Without those horses, no ruler could hope to win anything, and he believed that the king of Vijayanagara would do whatever was needed to secure that supply. So he sent Friar Louis to meet Krishnadeva. Louis travelled inland to Vijayanagara, carrying a proposal for an alliance with the Portuguese against the Samorin of Calicut. But Vijayanagara had no quarrel with the ruler of Calicut, and Louis was made to wait for weeks before Krishnadeva granted him an audience. In a later time, Krishnadeva would write verses on how foreign visitors, ambassadors should be treated with pomp and luxury, but he did not apply this to Louis. And when the friar finally managed to meet Krishnadeva, the talks were polite but cool. Krishnadeva sent envoys back to Goa with instructions to open discussions but make no promises. This was the heart of Krishnadeva's calculation. The Portuguese were too new, too unknown to tie himself to. They were not yet a threat to his heartland, which is the interior, but they held something that he would need horses in. That meant they were worth keeping close enough to talk to, and far enough to watch. The point is that Krishnadeva had assessed the Portuguese, not yet friends, not yet enemies, and he was to file them under to be managed later. The timing wasn't right for anything big, and his priorities lay elsewhere. For one thing, he had to handle the internal revolt from the Raja of Umattur in Mysore, and Krishnadeva decided it was necessary to quell the revolt with great force to prove a point with the court back home. I went over this in the previous episode. Friar Louis presently left Krishnadeva's court, but he was murdered before he could return to Goa. Naturally, this has sparked off great many enthusiastic interpretations. Who killed Friar Louis? No one has been able to tell. The years of the early 1510s saw the Portuguese engage in a great deal of violence in the Goa region. Clearly, they were here to stay, and it can be taken as a natural extension that they had designs on expanding their presence. While the Portuguese were a source of increasing trouble right down the western seaboard, it appears that both they and Krishnadeva saw the greater benefit in defining their relationship in trade rather than in conflict. Uneasy though such a situation might seem, given all the conflicts in which both sides were currently engaged. One of those conflicts was the new front with which Krishnadeva had to contend, eastward towards the Gajapatis in the Bay of Bengal. Bijapur had been checked, if not permanently contained, and the Portuguese had been filed under. Later, the political sky in the east began to look ripe for action. Golconda was busy securing Telangana. The Gajapatis, they were still strong, but they were pretty much overextended on the coast. Krishnadeva could read the map as well as any general. Similar to the west coast, the eastern seaboard was again not just a coastline, it was its own gateway. Ports like Machilipatnam and the river mouths of the Krishna and Godavari linked the plateau to the Bay of Bengal. Now, whoever held them could trade directly with Southeast Asia and tax every ship that docked and bring wealth into the empire without depending on western routes and without, of course, being held hostage by the Portuguese monopoly. By the early 1510s, Krishnadeva had the breathing space to make his move. The Gajapatis held territory that would give Vijayanagara a long reach into the coast. It was logical that Krishnadeva needed to take it. In this episode, I have attempted to show proof of Krishnadeva's strategic abilities, and that proof lay not in the number of wars that he fought, but the order in which he fought them. He knew when to strike, when to wait, and when to trade. Against Bijapur, swift, hard retaliation. Against the Portuguese, cautious diplomacy and strategic delays. And against the Gajapatis, war, when the timing promised lasting gains. The winds were shifting. The stage was set for Krishnadeva, whose next move would be eastward towards a confrontation that had been building for years. In the next episode, more action as Krishnadeva takes his campaign to the Andhra lands of Kondavidu and Rajamandri in his quest to take the entire south. And that is coming up as soon as I can bring it to you. Meanwhile, stay safe and stay dry. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.